The air in the Olympic National Forest tastes like cold earth, wet cedar, and absolute silence, and that, fundamentally, is what I pay for. I'm 35 now, the narrator of this mess, which makes me 30 when this all went down in the late spring of 2020. My close friend Chris and I have known each other since my first ill-advised stint in the dot-com bubble nearly 20 years ago. We both worked jobs that ate our souls but paid well in the tech sector, which is why our annual 4-day, gear-intensive trek into Washington's deepest isolation became a necessary psychological reset. We were the typical burned-out millennials, constantly connected, perpetually caffeinated, and desperate for 5 days in which our phones had 0 bars. Chris was the one who got me into serious backpacking a few years prior to this. I initially resisted. I couldn't fathom how walking away from a perfectly good Wi-Fi signal qualified as a vacation, but I instantly understood the release. For 4 days, your highest priority is not solving a legacy code error, but just not breaking your leg. It's pure, beautiful, exhausting simplicity. For our 2020 trip, Chris had upgraded our communication setup and was incredibly proud of his new gadgets, which should have been my first warning. The Olympic wilderness is notoriously spotty for any signal, and while we hiked strictly with the buddy system, Chris insisted on buying a pair of high-spec digital radio transceivers. These weren't cheap toys. They were rugged, military-grade hand units boasting impossible range and fantastic battery life. "Safety first, Alex," he'd said to me, adjusting the shoulder strap of his pack. "You lose footing on the White Pass Trail, the sat phone needs to be charged, and the radios are always on. You might think 2 guys camping out together don't need walkie-talkies. And you'd be right, mostly. But we discovered they were the perfect vehicle for ridiculous, low-stakes entertainment. If one of us wandered off-trail for 30 seconds to scout firewood or piss off some hidden vantage point, one of us would inevitably key the transmit button and announce an obscure situation report based on the old hiker manuals we'd laugh at. I'd be crouching to examine a broken twig far from the clearing, and Chris's tense, metallic voice would erupt from my pack. "Delta 907, this is Echo 40. Immediate recon required on Sector G. You're holding up the supply drop, idiot. Over." And back and forth we'd go, burning up 4 hours of solid, high-frequency mockery a day. It was silly, but it was our silly, and it made the silence of the wilderness bearable. The trouble started early Saturday afternoon. We'd planned a long hike, but an immediate emergency derailed it. Around 2 miles into our planned loop, I realized my large, heavy, emergency water purification tablet with its backup portable filter, an expensive thing you really can't lose, wasn't strapped to the outside of my bag where it should have been. I distinctly remembered setting it down on a rock a full hour earlier at a major junction to tie my boots. Since my backup water bottles were getting dangerously low, losing that much filtering capability was a logistical nightmare. After a quick, tense discussion, I volunteered to make the rough 5-mile round trip alone to the junction where I knew I'd left it. Chris, ever pragmatic, insisted on staying with the main camp and our more valuable, less portable gear. We agreed to check the radio often. For the outgoing journey, the radios worked surprisingly well, even around the ridgelines. I sent a few terse, mostly insult-free transmissions, found a good mushroom cluster, saw a huge raptor soaring above. Chris reciprocated with updates about the fire starting and the water filtration going well. Then, about 3 miles along, dipping deep into a valley thick with old-growth forest that filtered the afternoon sun into a cold mint green, my radio went silent. Static. White noise that sounded like sandpaper rubbing up against paper. I tested it periodically, still static. The hills and the density had created a dead zone. I kept walking, convinced I was close. Only when I started climbing out of the deepest part of the valley, maybe a half-mile from the junction, did the transceiver crackle weakly back to life. I thumbed the PTT, push to talk, button and shouted, "Chris, do you copy now? Delta 40 checking in, over." Silence. I switched the unit off and on again, an idiotic but habitual gesture. The moment the unit clicked back on, it was different. Cleared up. And the radio wasn't receiving simple static. It was playing back a live audio feed. The quality was high, much clearer than any connection Chris and I had made all day, but the content was sickening. What I heard was a man suddenly, terrifyingly sobbing. It wasn't a sudden, horrified scream. It was soft, raw, ragged whimpering, broken up by gasps for air. The kind of completely dismantled crying that only happens when someone has crossed the Rubicon of pain, guilt, or loss. The worst sounds are the ones you imagine coming from your closest friend, and I instantly pictured Chris having received a horrible, private text about his wife or kid, the kind of bad news you can't react to with anything but silent collapse. I sped up my walk, bordering on a jog, yelling into my unit. Chris! Chris, talk to me! Are you okay? What happened, man? Over! He didn't reply. I assumed the range was still too fractured for him to hear me, yet the quality of his distress was coming through crystal clear. I started jogging properly, now fully gripped by a cold, stomach-lurching fear. I kept the unit pressed to my ear, waiting for the whimpering voice to coalesce into something I could understand. And it did. The sobbing man suddenly, raspy clear, forced the words out, not talking to me, but into his own unit. Eleanor! Eleanor, I am so sorry. I never meant for this to... He dissolved back into a horrifying, gasping sob. I yelled again. Who the hell is Eleanor, Chris? What are you talking about? I'm coming, hang in there. My heart hammered against my ribcage. Chris had never mentioned any Eleanor. It wasn't his wife. When the man on the radio began to get louder, wailing now, pleading in a terrifying baritone, I shoved all sanity aside and dropped my backpack, running full sprint for the junction. Please forgive me, Eleanor. Please, I swear I didn't see. Oh God, please forgive me. And then, just as the cries reached a peak, suddenly transforming into a terrified, electronic, high-pitched death scream, the kind of sound that sounds more like ripping and tearing aluminum foil than a human voice. The terrifying protracted noise was cut off. The radio simply went dead. High-end, expensive silence in the deep of the forest. I didn't stop. I ran back like absolute hell, leaping over logs, scrambling through mud on the steep climb back towards the camp. I'd bypassed the critical filter tablet entirely, a bear suddenly seeming like a minor inconvenience. I covered the last mile, fueled entirely by adrenaline and the raw, horrifying fear of having just heard my closest friend die in a moment of utter mental unraveling. I burst into the clearing. Our tent was standing. The fire pit was established, logs neatly piled around it. Our massive packs were leaning against a bench. Empty. Chris! Chris, where are you? I roared, breathless, turning a full 360 degrees while grabbing a heavy, fallen metal flask as a primitive weapon. What is wrong with you? A bewildered voice called out behind me. I spun. Chris walked calmly out from behind a massive, mossy trunk of a felled cedar tree, a large bundle of neatly sectioned firewood cradled under his arm. He looked entirely unmarked, dry, placid, and annoyingly sane. He had some dirt on his jacket from the work, but there was no fear, no despair, no trace of tears or panic. To him, I was the one who was suddenly feral, red-faced, covered in sweat, holding a thermos like a morning star, and screaming over a sudden sound. I took 2 steps toward him and, confused, managed to gasp. Is this a joke? Was that you? Chris frowned. Dude, I've been chopping wood for the last 20 minutes and getting the water purification set up. What was me? What did I miss? Did you finally get the filter? He held up his hand, revealing a small black radio transceiver, his unit, clasped tightly in his palm. My radio's cut out entirely as soon as you hit the bottom of the last trough. Dead quiet since then. What's the massive emergency, Alex? The immediate, washing relief that he was okay was physical. He was alive. Nothing happened. I began to tell him the terrifying story, the sobbing, the clear break in protocol, the words of deep, paralyzing apology, the final electronic scream. Chris listened, his confusion slowly hardening into a quiet disbelief. Alex, I haven't cried in 10 years. And no sound has come from this radio since 1:15. He insisted. You just hit a static patch and hallucinated on the stress of the hike. I knew what I'd heard. I let him tell me how irrational it was before I got to the core. It wasn't just crying, Chris. The man, whoever it was saying they were sorry to a name. He repeatedly used the name, Eleanor. The moment I voiced the syllables, Eleanor, Chris's face didn't go pale, or angry, or confused. It simply went blank, wiped clean of all emotion. His pragmatic engineer's mind stalled. He narrowed his eyes and lowered the bundle of sticks carefully to the ground, focusing every inch of his attention on my eyes. You haven't been talking to Lisa, have you? You didn't, sneak a text while I was chopping wood? You didn't snoop my phone, did you, Alex? His voice was cold, accusingly level. I exploded, completely defensive. No! What the hell are you talking about? I heard that name on some ghost frequency. All I know is that 2 minutes after that name, the man screamed and went dead. Who the hell is Eleanor, Chris? Chris stepped back, ran a hand over his face. He looked at the perfect silence of the green valley, then back to me, the color finally draining from his cheeks. You're going to shit your pants. I swear to God, you have to swear to me you haven't talked to her. I repeated the oath violently. He took a final, deep breath. Alex, Eleanor, that's the girl's name. Yesterday, before we left, my wife told me she's pregnant. We hadn't told anyone. Eleanor is the name we picked together last night. No one else in the world knows that name.